Do-
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Near and Rupar. There we go. Everybody came in all at once, 49 of you strong. I am Aaron Rupar. Obviously, David is not with us this week. He is taking the week off, but I have a very special guest, Matt Gertz from Media Matters, a senior fellow who I think we had on the podcast one time previously, about a year ago, but it's great to have you again. Thanks for making time for doing this. I'm sure most of the audience here is familiar with Matt's work. It stretches back now almost 20 years. I think you mentioned on your bio on the Media Matters site that you started in 2007. So you've seen a lot of changes over that time. But right off the top, I guess I'm kind of curious. I think some people on social media probably know you from one of the more funny recurring bits, which was anytime Matt Gates was in the news, you'd have a funny either tweet or post on Blue Sky, kind of like bracing for impact with people flooding your mentions, because your name scans a lot like Gates when you just kind of look at it. Matt Gates has not been in the news as much as he was, these days as compared to a year, 2 years ago. But are your mentions still flooded with people thinking that you're Matt Gates?
They are not. I really dodged a bullet there with that attorney general slot falling through. If we were only going to lose one Donald Trump nominee, I'm glad it was him, just for my own sake. But basically, what used to happen is the search on Twitter used to be very strange and would, I think, as people were starting to type in MATTG, would populate my name before his because I had more followers than him at the time. And because of that, people who would hear that Matt Gaetz had done something and decided that they were very angry about that, like when he went on Alex Jones or when he stormed the skiff or what have you, back during the first Trump term, they would come barging into my mentions, being very mad at whatever they thought I had done. Um, and so, I started adopting a bit of a running gag on social media about that. I would respond wrong guy to a lot of people who do that to me. Um, I would occasionally get into long running back and forths with people until they finally realized that they were talking to the wrong person. You have to have fun with something like that, otherwise you're just going to lose your mind. And that was the choice that I made. But over on Blue Sky, it's less of a problem since
Right.
the congressman is not over there, as far as I can tell. And so things have calmed down a bit since then.
And it is this is a little off topic, but is Gates still a host on OAN? Is he still up to that these days?
My understanding is yes, though, as
Good.
no one actually watches OAN, it can
Yeah.
be hard to tell. That is a network that really has fallen off, and the fact that he was unable to snag something at either Newsmax or Fox News, I think, speaks to the fact that he just did not have a lot of broad support. Wasn't he once he left office? Possibly
Yeah.
because of the young girls.
Yeah. Which, in hindsight, it's a little bit surprising that, the Gates nomination was kind of a bridge too far compared, since we've seen obviously Kash Patel get confirmed and the Parade of Horribles, Hegseth. You kind of wonder had, Trump really pushed to have a hearing for him, if that could have turned out differently. But I guess for the sake of your mentions, it's good that it turned out the way that it did. So let me mention off the top here that if you are a paid subscriber to Public Notice, you can ask us questions in the live chat that is scrolling to my right here on the screen. So if you have questions for Matt over the course of our conversation, please post them in the chat and I'll get to them as they come in. So I thought maybe a good place to start as was something that Matt wrote recently on the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is taking place tomorrow night. Now, I think it's pretty obvious, I'm sure, to most people who are in here why that seems like such a strange idea that the Correspondents Association would have to invite Trump, who, of course, undermines press freedoms at every turn and has specifically, attacked some of the very same correspondents who will be in the building tomorrow night as he delivers a speech. So I guess I'm curious just to get your read on, why you think the Correspondents Association would invite Trump. Is it kind of like a Stockholm syndrome situation, or what do you think's going on there?
I think it's a combination of traditionalism and a lack of imagination. So, just to zoom out a bit, the idea behind the White House Correspondents' Dinner is that it's an annual event in which the White House Correspondents Association, which is like the trade association for White House reporters, they raise money for scholarships for young journalists. They hand out awards. And every year they invite the president of the United States. The president always speaks. And usually, I think the theory of it is, it's an opportunity for the president to have a kind of light night with the press, tell some jokes, and at some point, express his support for the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. I mean, traditionally, that has not been a partisan idea. It is a sort of bedrock liberal principle that people from both parties could agree with. But that is no longer the case, quite obviously. There's always been a certain amount of criticism that this is an event in which, with any president, the White House and the press get too cozy and I don't want to diminish that sort of broader criticism, but I do think that with Donald Trump, there's just a different set of issues and problems that dinner creates and provokes. And so, I think what happened is they invited him every time during his first term. He always turned them down. And so I think they were kind of the dog that caught the car here. They invited him thinking that he was going to say no. He publicly said yes. And so they kind of were stuck because obviously you can't celebrate the First Amendment with Donald Trump. He doesn't believe in the freedom of the press to any real extent. He uses state power to try to cudgel news outlets into line. He is currently suing the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the BBC and the Des Moines Register and a few others I'm sure that I am forgetting. And so it doesn't really make any sense. But I think they kind of screwed themselves. They kind of got themselves stuck. They were so wedded to this tradition of inviting the president that they didn't imagine what could happen if he actually said yes.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a side point, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on the curious practice that we've seen more and more of Trump calling up individual reporters for, kind of amount to like verbal Truth Social posts, where you get this weird dynamic of reporters spanning from like Caitlin Collins to have seen like News Nation reporters, kind of tweeting, I just got off the phone with the president. Here's what he told me. There rarely seems to be, too many hard-hitting questions asked in the course of these interactions. But do you think this is kind of an intentional? I mean, I'm sure it is an intentional media strategy on some level that Trump is trying to implement here. And why would he do that? Do you think it's just kind of like a way to better control the message and sort of have the veneer of being accessible to these reporters? Or what do you think's going on with that?
My understanding is it's the other way around. It's not necessarily him calling them up. It's that every White House reporter has the president's personal cell phone and he picks up when they reach out. And so that just creates a situation where there's a lot of pressure on the reporters, I'm sure, from their editors, since they know that they can do that, to get these little exclusives with the president. The problem, though, is that what the president says is not actually useful in any real way, because as you say, he's basically doing Truth Social posts over the phone. So, he'll say, yeah, we're about to get the Strait opened. Everything's going great. And like, that's an exclusive with the president. So it's hard for reporters to make the case that they shouldn't publish something about that. But the president is either delusional or lying, like a very large percentage of the time. And so the benefit to the audience, I think, ends up being pretty marginal because you can't actually trust what the president is saying.
Yeah, it's a very curious thing. And, Trump still does occasionally do press conferences where he will take questions from reporters, but it seems like in lieu of that, sometimes he does these phone calls, although, I'm sure you track this too. Like yesterday was kind of a bewildering day because Trump had an Oval Office event, which is the one where he was kind of dozing off, which I watched as it was happening. And then my kids came home from school. And then, like an hour later, he had another Oval Office event tied to Lebanon and Israeli officials being in D.C., for their ceasefire negotiations. But it can be very unpredictable, like when he talks to reporters. I know he's traveling to Florida tonight, so it seems like there's kind of an expectation he might gaggle outside the White House. So, he is, I guess, in a way accessible and does engage with the press. But as you were saying, the content of what he says is not often very meaningful because it's completely untethered from reality, or he's lying. And you'd like to see some of these reporters who get him on the phone, maybe indicate some awareness of that or ask follow-ups. And maybe they're just not afforded the opportunity. But it does seem like they're kind of very eager to signify that they got the president on the phone. And then, the actual content of the interaction seems kind of secondary to the announcement that they actually talked to him. But I do want to go back and, like I mentioned at the top, I mean, you've been at Media Matters for 20 years. So, you've seen a lot of stuff. You were obviously there for the entire first Trump term, even prior to that, kind of the rise of Fox News during the Obama years. And, I started reading your stuff regularly when I moved out to DC in 2016. And, obviously our work has kind of overlapped in the sense that I watch a lot of Fox, you watch a lot of Fox, and you still watch a lot of Fox. Just reading through some of your recent coverage, which is really, you do a great job contextualizing things. Just before we went live, I read your piece from about 6 weeks ago on when the ICE agents were deployed to airports and kind of how that percolated from something Scott Pressler had said on the Clay and Buck show to Clay Travis then going on Fox News and talking about, this caller to his show. And then from there, apparently to Trump's brain and then to policy. So, that you have a lot of good in-depth coverage of that sort that kind of goes beyond just what people are seeing on their screens to kind of the reasons that is happening. But very broadly, I'm kind of curious to get your take on the role of the Fox empire in Trump 2.0, because, I think back to Trump 1.0 and, I was new to covering national politics at that time, but there was something very novel about the function that Fox served as kind of like an administration mouthpiece where, you'd have the press secretary constantly on Fox. Trump himself would call into Fox and Friends. And you still have that in Trump 2.0, but, obviously the media landscape is so fractured now with the rise of kind of the podcast sphere. And, we saw how that was so influential in the 2024 campaign. So, how do you think about Trump 2.0? And maybe, do you think the role that Fox plays is kind of similar to what it was in Trump 1.0, or how has it shifted?
Yeah, I think there's two different questions here. One is about Fox's role within the broader right-wing ecosystem. Obviously, it's much more fractured than it was during the first Trump term. You have a wide array of podcasters, many of whom used to work at Fox, who have now hung out their own shingles and developed their own audiences. You have an array of influencers on different social media platforms who, again, have built out their own audiences and are able to shape the debate that way. But Donald Trump and his administration are a little bit a different part of this, because Donald Trump just watches Fox News. Like, he does not spend time listening to podcasts. He does not spend time, I think, following a lot of discourse on social media platforms. The way that he gets information from outside the administration, I think, continues to be Fox News. Now, I think somewhat less of an impact than it did in the first administration, because the second Trump administration is itself much more a creation of Fox News. If you think back to 2016, 2017, 2018, Donald Trump came to Washington without a lot of outlets, right? Like, he had done a hostile takeover of the Republican Party for all intents and purposes. He did not have a long tail of Republican political operatives who supported him personally. And so Fox's function, to a large extent, was to get him information from people who supported him, because Fox was the major power center that backed him at that time. and get ideas to him directly. And now, in the time period since then, over the course of his period outside the White House, his campaign back, he did build a lot of that infrastructure and a lot of that political operative class, a lot of people who support him personally. Um, he drew from that for his administration, and he drew from Fox News for his administration. I mean, the reality that we live in is one in which Pete Hegseth, the former Fox and Friends weekend host, is the Secretary of Defense. That's a very bizarre scenario, but what it means is that Trump has people who he trusts in those positions because he's seen them saying nice things about him for years and years on television. Um, and they are able to kind of get ideas to him in ways that he appreciates because of their past time on that network. And so, because of that, and because I would say the talent pool on Fox News has kind of shrunk since that first term, I think the network is much more of a one-way communications apparatus, kind of channeling whatever the president wants to hear at any given moment, rather than trying to bring independent ideas into his sort of sphere of influence. Though, as you say, from time to time it does happen. It happened with putting ICE in airports. It happened to a large extent with the Iran war, but it's less of a day-to-day phenomenon, I think, than we saw during that first term.
Yeah, and kind of connected to this was a piece that you wrote, I think just yesterday, on Maria Bartiromo, who is on Fox Business, not Fox News. But if you really want to get kind of the true propaganda, I think that's probably the best source on Fox, for because she gets high-profile guests, including cabinet secretaries, and in this case, the president's son. Eric Trump, who was on there yesterday because one of his companies secured a 24, is it $1 million contract, I believe it is. Yeah, million, not billion, would be an extreme amount of money. It's million, I believe. But and I believe you wrote about this for MS Now, how the years that Fox spent kind of conspiracy mongering about the alleged Biden crime family, as they put it, which was this idea that Hunter was kind of like the bag man for his father. It's become like an actual business model, for the Trump administration 2.0. But I think a lot of people saw that clip of Eric Trump on Maria's show, and it's almost like kind of beyond parody, in the sense that when you put that side by side with some of the coverage, and especially Maria's show, you saw of Hunter Biden, it's just amazing the amount of cognitive dissonance that people can live with. I mean, what is your sense of someone like Maria when she does something like that? Do you think is it really just like a tolerance for cognitive dissonance, or is it shamelessness, or some kind of combo that can allow her, with a straight face, to congratulate the president's son for securing a Pentagon contract when he has no background in robotics, which is the contract at hand here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it could be any of those, shamelessness, or just like an inability to comprehend that there is a very obvious parallel to something that she complained about for years. I mean, $24 million in the grand scheme of things, in the scheme of the federal budget, is not a chunk of money, but it is more than the entire total of international business dealings that the House Republicans complained that the Bidens and their associates had been paid over a period of several years. So, like, the I get very angry about this because, like, the looting that is going on from the White House to benefit the president and his family members is just like nonstop right now. It's orders of magnitude larger than anything that Hunter Biden did, or anything closely, even near any of that. And it's much more tied into the day-to-day machinations of the actual president. All the Hunter Biden stuff happened either when Joe Biden was vice president or when he was out of office. There was no allegations related to when Joe Biden was president of the United States. But you see the Trump sons increasing their holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars. You see Donald Trump himself gaining an extra billion here or there. It's just it's nonstop looting. It's really grotesque. But Fox News's number one mandate is to just support whatever Donald Trump does. So they would never dream of giving Eric Trump or Donald Trump Jr. anything close to the coverage that they gave Hunter and the Bidens.
Yeah, and reminder here that if you have questions for Matt, please put them in the chat. I'm seeing some nice commentary about our discussion here, but no actionable questions as of this moment in time. So if you have them, please post them in the chat. Matt, I'm curious. I know you don't really write about this per se, but there was some discussion after, I guess, in the lead up and then immediately following January 6th of, Newsmax kind of cutting into Fox's audience because they were sort of outflanking Fox on the craziness, and like inciting the coup attempt, the whole stolen election bit. I haven't seen much coverage out there of Fox's ratings lately. I know that Tucker for a long time was kind of their top rated host. And then of course he got fired and, the Five was doing really well in the ratings for a while. But, you mentioned earlier the talent pool maybe being a little bit thinner. I guess maybe that's exemplified with Tucker Carlson leaving and being replaced by Jesse Waters, who I think, by all accounts is kind of a lesser talent than Tucker is. But what is the state of Fox's ratings these days, if you track that? And, what can we learn from that?
I haven't spent a ton of time on the Fox ratings. My sense is that, it's seeing a little bit of the deterioration that we have seen with cord cutting in general, across the board for linear television. There hasn't been a sort of steep decline. There hasn't been a, rising threat from something like Newsmax. I mean, I think what happened in late 2020 was Fox had sort of a near-death experience after they very briefly suggested that Joe Biden had won the election while Donald Trump was still contesting it before they immediately, what happened then was Donald Trump lashed out at Fox. There was a big push from Fox's viewer base over to Newsmax, and the network responded by freaking out and really doubling and tripling down on stolen election stuff to the point where they ended up being successfully sued for defamation by Dominion Voting Systems and needing to pay a settlement of $787 million. But I think for Fox, that's cheap at the price, right? Like they still have the audience, which means they can still bring in the revenues. And what I think they learned from that was you can't get crosswise with Donald Trump. You can avoid talking about particular issues. You can talk about voter fraud without mentioning specific companies in order to avoid potential defamation actions. But you can't say the president is saying that he actually won the 2020 election and that it was stolen from him. And in fact, that is not true. That is a story that you do not see on Fox News.
Yeah, and how, if at all, did the Dominion settlement change the way that Fox talks about Trump's big lie and election lies? I guess you just kind of touched upon that, where there's ways to kind of couch it that aren't actionable, and so maybe that's all it is. But I noticed when Trump was on Maria Bartiromo's show, I think that was just last weekend, where he said something along the lines of everybody knows the election was rigged, and now that's coming out. Then Maria kind of nodded and did a yup, but didn't. So I guess agreeing with him, but they do seem to be careful, at least to the extent of avoiding actionable comments that are lies.
I think that's right. And I think they haven't really had to address it in a large way since then. I think, Donald Trump won the 2024 election, and so they didn't have to deal with the prospect of him losing and claiming that he had actually won. I think the big test will be, or at least the first major test will be if the midterms happen and the Democrats do very, very well and Donald Trump starts claiming that those elections were rigged, then how is Fox going to respond? Because at that point, it becomes a major national story that will require them to cover in some way. My guess will be that they will avoid the specifics as much as they can, while still, nodding in support of Trump. But we'll have to see how that plays out.
Do you know, has Fox this week at all, to your knowledge, talked about the crazy post that Trump put up? I think it was yesterday about the Virginia redistricting referendum that he proclaimed to be rigged, despite there being, no actual allegations from anybody of any sort of malfeasance. Because I guess that would be an interesting test case to see if how they would handle something like that. But as is the case with a lot of things he posts on True Social, my sense is maybe they just ignored that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's just a one-off. He hasn't sort of leaned into that with a, series of posts followed by a series of public comments or anything like that. I think in general, when Trump says something particularly crazy and they can avoid talking about it, that's generally what Fox does. And so it's really more of a question of whether there's a sustained push by Trump, how Fox will try to respond to that.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a question here from someone with the handle Not Night Satan. Interested in the origin of that particular username, but they ask, "How bad is this Ellison takeover and the mergers?" And I bring that up now because I did want to eventually segue into some of the writing you did about a month ago. The headline on this particular piece is "Legacy outlets that bent the knee to Trump haven't just lost credibility; they're bleeding readers and viewers." The top part is about CBS and the evening news and how their ratings, at least as of the end of March, were hitting kind of historical lows for them. I guess with the Ellison takeover, part of what I take the question to be referring to is the news that, Paramount will be running CNN at some point. That news was it was out there about like a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, that, the CNN the ownership was changing. I haven't seen a lot of stuff since then. Maybe let's start on the CNN piece. Do you have any understanding of like what the timeline is for any sort of big changes with that? And how concerned are you about the future of CNN?
Yeah, I mean, I think if this takes place, it wouldn't be until next year at least. These mergers tend to take a while just to move through the bureaucracy and to move through the sort of business side of it. Um, but and they might still face some sort of pushback from Democratic attorneys general or something like that. Um, but I think the reality here is that Donald Trump really wants to steer media entities to his buddies. And that, I think, has been one of the through lines of his second term. We saw the Ellisons take over CBS News. Now it looks like they're taking over CNN's parent company. At the same time, you see a movement from the Washington Post in a more Trump-friendly direction on its opinion side. And so this is the kind of the Viktor Orban plan that we've seen him hinting about enacting over the past several years. Um, and so I think it's a fairly substantial worry. What I think the question is always like, what part of this is the real threat? And I think with these takeovers, it's less that these outlets are going to like successfully propagandize a new generation into being more conservative by becoming like more Fox than they are now. I think it's more that they break the entities altogether. Because, they're unlike Hungary, there's fairly low barriers to access or barriers to entry for media companies. And so what I think what we're seeing at CBS is as the network becomes Trumpier, the audience flees. They go to its competitors, the direct competitors like ABC or NBC, or to other outlets on Substack or what have you, that they think are going to do a better job of getting them the news that they want. And then I think the problem becomes, though, that one thing that these big media outlets are good at is employing a large number of reporters who can do investigative work on a really granular level. That's just harder to do on a smaller scale. And so because of that, my fear with these outlets, and we've seen it to some extent already, is, you've seen huge layoffs at the Washington Post. You've seen big layoffs at CBS. I think if the Ellison plan goes through, I think we'll see an attempt to kind of merge CBS and CNN together in a way that will lead to mass firings of reporters who are at CNN now. And so that, the cost there is less in the news getting skewed, though it will be skewed, I think, than it is in fewer cops on the beat, fewer reporters out there able to do that hard job of finding out the stories that Donald Trump doesn't want told.
Yeah, and in your piece, I was really intrigued by, because I hadn't thought of it quite in the way that you lay it out. Why, when outlets like CBS make a bid for tapping into a more right wing audience, it's almost by definition doomed to fail, just given kind of the nature of right wing thought about mass media. But maybe explain that to people, why the very idea of we're going to maybe we'll lose some viewers on the left, but we're going to tap into this more right wing audience. Why that's kind of a doomed endeavor from the start.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a couple of things. The backdrop here is you have a broad decline of linear broadcast and cable news, right? You just have lower numbers of people tuning in part because there are just fewer people watching regular television. More people are getting, streaming services or what have you. There's just fewer people tuning in to watch the stuff in the first place. The second piece is that you have a broad decline in support for the press, sort of a broad decline in people who say that they trust the media. And that is overwhelmingly coming from Republicans, where the numbers are like 8-10% of Republicans who say that they trust the major news outlets. And so, it's what you see there is you end up with a business case that looks like this. It's like, well, obviously we need to do something different because the number of people who are tuning in is declining and will continue to decline. And we know that Republicans are the people who aren't currently watching. So what if we made a big shift in our programming to be more friendly to Republicans, and then we can bring in those Republican viewers and bolster our audience? We have two problems there. One is that those Republicans have been told for years, generations, that they can't trust the press by people who they trust a lot more than the people who run CBS News or the Washington Post or what have you. And they have developed their own tastes and their own set of media outlets that they prefer, like Fox News, that have pre-existing relationships with those viewers at this point. They have talent that the audiences are familiar with, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very hard to get those people to break their pre-existing relationships with avowed right-wing outlets and come back to these mainstream media outlets. The second part is when you dramatically move the content to the right because you're trying to attract those right-wing audience members, you're going to piss off your current audience members. And if you're watching broadcast media in the year of our Lord 2026, you are probably pretty liberal because otherwise you would be watching Fox News. I think that's the harsh reality that CBS is running into now. They decided they had to make some sort of big change, which maybe they do if they want to maintain their current revenue levels. And then they found a thing that was a big change that they could make. But the big change that they decided to make ended up being wildly counterproductive. And now they're just kind of stuck because they can't swing back. Because it just wouldn't be credible to the people who have now dropped CBS to say, well, oops, we're going to try again. I guess we're going to bring you back. We're going to go back to the Murrow model that we have discarded over the past several months. But they're just not rebuilt. They're not bringing in those new viewers because those viewers were already well served by existing right-wing media institutions.
Have you been watching much of the CBS evening news? It seemed like there was kind of some curiosity surrounding it initially. There was certain segments I know got a lot of pickup right after the new direction kind of began, but I feel like I haven't really seen much from it lately. So I'm just kind of curious, like how propagandized that telecast is at this point.
You know, it's a mix, I would say. I think, um, the handpicked CBS Evening News anchor Tony Dokapel, I think that's the
I
pronunciation.
think that's right.
Yeah,
I was scared to try to say his name, but I
yeah.
believe that that's correct. Yeah.
I mean, I think he's done a bunch of like waving to both sides coverage stuff. But the actual newsroom, it has still been pretty strong. They did actually a very hard hitting report in which they got a soldier from the Kuwait base that was hit by Iran in the early days of the war on the record, sort of masked his voice and his appearance, but he was saying outright, like, Pete Hegseth was lying about this. We were unprepared for these strikes. They just did not do enough. It was sort of a very much a Benghazi situation. And CBS News were the ones who did that, and kudos to them. And that, I think, again, is my big fear about these takeovers. It's less about the day-to-day propaganda than it is about whether coverage like that will still happen 6 months or a year from now if they continue cutting away at the reporting core.
Hmm. I wanted to bring up here in the time we have left one other thing that you wrote recently from early April that I thought was kind of fascinating about Laura Ingraham and how, for one glorious evening, she kind of broke from the Trump regime line on Iran and used her monologue to raise concerns about things kind of spiraling out of control in the Middle East in a midterms year, and then as you documented, basically the next night, which I think coincided with the primetime speech that Trump gave, which in hindsight was kind of pointless. People were expecting some big announcement, but it was just kind of the same stuff he had been saying for the month leading up to that about, the war being over, but we won, but we've almost won and we need to negotiate and, and so on and so on. Um, what do you think explains, when someone like Laura Ingraham, who obviously is quite plugged in with, the Trump world people, you know, kind of has a little bit of daylight one night and then snaps back into step with Trump and the people around him the next night. Do you think it really is, something where she's getting feedback that's kind of out of step and unacceptable, or is it just kind of every day is a new day for someone like that, and consistency isn't a concern? Because I think that is kind of bewildering, and I also wonder if her viewers notice it in the way that you do, that the editorial line from one night to the next change.
I mean, I think it's very possible that she got a lot of pushback from her viewers after she said that. Anytime a Fox News, host, one who is like part of these right wing propaganda uh, uh, sort of primetime block, steps out of line and gets a lot of coverage from mainstream news outlets about stepping out of line, that's not really a good sign for her relationship with her audience. Um, at the same time, I think you also have the reality that Donald Trump is very willing to go after people in the right wing press who start criticizing him at all. I think we've seen over the last several weeks a lot of attacks on Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and others of this sort of Trump critical wing on Iran. Trump's been trying to smack them down pretty hard because they are independent operators. He has fewer levers to push on. But for a Fox News host, there's a lot more that he can do to directly impact Fox News. He could start attacking, the network more broadly in ways that would be detrimental. And so I think there's I think there's a feeling from the Fox News house that they just have less room to maneuver on stuff like this. And there's just no point in chancing it by stepping out of line, by suggesting that Donald Trump did something wrong at some point.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Trump's attacks on Tucker and Candace and Alex Jones, because to me, when I first saw him starting to do that, and of course he's had many posts, and I think he's even brought it up during press gaggle, some of, that they're losers and, and things like that. But it seems risky, because obviously, Candace has a huge show. I think it's one of the top political podcasts, and, Tucker has a huge audience. No, that this has been going on for a couple of weeks. I can't say I'm like a regular viewer of Tucker or of Candace, and I'm guessing from your coverage that maybe you aren't either, just because I know you don't write about them a lot. But were you at all surprised that Trump would take that tact of, possibly kind of further fragmenting his hardcore base and creating enemies? Because to me, it seemed pretty high risk, and I'm kind of curious how that is playing out.
I mean, I think historically he's been very, very willing to, go after anyone within the Republican Party and within, Fox News who he thinks is being too critical of him. He's been sort of going after Jessica Tarlov, the Democratic panelist on The Five, for a long time. He has sort of maintained a long-running war against Fox News's polling operation. And, he obviously criticized a lot of people at Fox News who are not there anymore, like Neil Cavuto and Shep Smith. And, I guess Steve Doocy is sometimes around, but not as much these days. And so, I think it doesn't really surprise me that he would go after them. I think, he what I always find interesting and kind of amusing about these, fights within the right-wing media apparatus and between Trump and them is that like everyone's 100% correct. Like Donald Trump is correct that Tucker Carlson is like a kook and that Candace Owens is crazy. Tucker Carlson is correct that Mark Levin is like a bloodthirsty warmonger. Mark Levin is correct that Tucker Carlson is an anti-Semite. Like they're all 100% right, right in a way that they almost never are on any subject. And so I get a lot of pleasure out of watching them attack each other. Certainly, it has been much more common over the last several months, and sort of increasingly over the course of the Trump presidency. I think that speaks to how he brought together like a really broad coalition of, right-wing demagogues and crackpots and conspiracy theorists, all sort of united against the idea of a Democrat becoming president or staying president. And once Trump himself became president, you started seeing more of the tensions between those different crazy wings of his coalition. And I think we should expect that to continue, certainly into the midterms. I think if the Democrats do very well in the midterms, it'll really be knives out at that point, too.
Yeah, and just exit question for you here on the way out. For people who are listening to this, and obviously part of the service that you provide, that I try to provide too, is watching some of these shows so people don't have to, because who wants to endure Fox all day unless you're kind of already guzzling the Kool-Aid. But are there any shows on Fox these days that you find to be more interesting than others? I mean, you brought up some names like the Shep Smith show back in the day, or even Neil Cavuto, who would criticize Trump. I remember on COVID, he would do that. That's less the case these days. I mean, Jessica Tarlov is kind of a voice in the wilderness on The Five, but that's kind of more commentary. So are there any shows that you kind of find more interesting? And if there are any like that, why?
It's really a lot of sameness at this point. There isn't a lot of distinction and differentiation between the different shows at this point. You're not seeing voices like Shep Smith or Neil Cavuto, even who have like even a mildly different perspective that is more Trump critical. This time around, and like as I said, like the talent level just seems to have dropped off fairly substantially. Someone like Jesse Waters just doesn't have anything interesting to say. every night it is a sort of goldfish effect, where there's not really a lot of a connection between the previous night's events and the current ones, just because Trump might be doing something totally different, and they all just need to find a way to get behind whatever is happening. As a real sicko, as someone who has been watching this stuff for a very long time and seen it become incredibly destructive and awful, in its impact on the real world, the ability to derive entertainment from it has really gone down in recent years, and it's certainly posing a problem to my ability to stay awake sometimes.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I get up and I still tune into Maria just because she does get, Scott Bessent or Lutnick or, kind of heavy hitters. Brooke Rollins will be on the show. And so at least they're kind of newsworthy interviews, and that, sometimes they'll say things that make headlines. But yeah, I mean, the sameness is kind of the order of the day on Fox, and it does make for monotonous viewing, even if their viewership is pretty entrenched and probably aging. And maybe next time we have you on, it'd be great to get into kind of more of the podcast ecosystem and kind of how that's cutting into the influence that Fox once had, and what that portends going forward. But Matt, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining. Over 1,000 people are tuned in, so that's a great audience, and highly recommend, if you're not regularly checking out Matt's work on the Media Matters site. It's some of the best media commentary out there. And then you're also writing these days for MS Now. So anything that you want to plug here at the end?
You can also follow me on Blue Sky at Matt Gertz, Gertz. Be very careful with that one, though. I guess it won't accidentally land on the congressman, since I don't believe he's actually over there.
I did, when I tagged you, I had a couple people replying that there's a popular account called Matt Gates's Forehead or something like that, which I believe I follow. It's a parody account, but, cracking a lot of jokes. And people were saying that, at some future week, I should have Matt Gates's forehead on as well. So I guess the joke, it still continues to trail you, even though you're not really. I guess you still are on X, but you're not posting as much, right? Or are you
no, I am not. I'm not posting on X.
Okay. Well, good to know. I guess maybe I'm just seeing Matt Gates's tweets and getting you guys confused again. But yeah, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks for everybody for tuning in. We will see you next Friday. And Matt, keep up the good work. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Let's do it again.
See ya.